Today, we're joined by our guest, Ben Ortsleb. Ben is the head of corporate development and strategy at LinkedIn, where he collaborates with the executive team and line of business leaders to develop strategies and lead the M&A process, from sourcing to deal negotiation and execution to post-merger integration. Ben also co-founded and serves as a general partner at 212 Angels, a venture capital firm that invests in seed-stage startups in the enterprise tech and fintech spaces. Ben has an MBA from the Wharton School, a CFA charter, and an MS from Institut Polytechnique de Paris. Ben, welcome to Wharton Tech Talks. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
When was the last time you were in Philadelphia?
10 years ago? Oh, no, actually, I came for one of my reunions, so probably 5 years ago.
Awesome. I should come back and visit soon. To get started, we always love to just understand your background and how you ended up in the technology industry. When did you first realize that you wanted to build a career in tech?
Probably a little bit by default. I went to an engineering school. In France, the system is a little bit different, but you basically go to university or you go to either engineering or management school. And I was good at math and physics, so I went down the engineering path. It doesn't mean that you have to be an engineer afterwards. It's just what the education path looks like. I went to an engineering school with focus on telecom and ended up my first job was actually working for sort of a telecom consulting firm. So that was my first foray into tech before switching, but with sort of always a view that what I was doing and sort of more engineering techie products were interesting.
Awesome. And then you decided to get your MBA at Wharton.
Yes.
And then you went into consulting afterwards, which is a little bit, I guess, different from tech. Did you go into consulting with the idea of eventually wanting to end up in tech, or was this kind of your way of exploring what else is out there?
Well, there's a couple of things. I think before that, I even did a switch to finance, which was partially also then extends to Wharton, but I did the CFA on my own and started working in banking in very traditional industries in LBOs. So you end up literally working with coffee plants in the middle of the US or stuff like that. Wharton was a way to sort of reset a little bit my career trajectory, also candidly a way to get more long-term into the US. Both those things actually happened via consulting. And consulting was a way to continue exploring industries, but San Francisco was both because I love San Francisco and a good place for tech and tech clients. So that was a good mix of both things.
Awesome. And how did you decide to work at LinkedIn?
I was coming to the end of consulting, too much travel. I had a baby and she and I wanted to see each other a little bit more. At the time, I ended up talking with both Google and LinkedIn, and I got more excited about the team that I was talking with at LinkedIn in particular. So I ended up joining LinkedIn first time in business operations, which is sort of a classic landing pad for ex-consultants and ex-bankers, mostly people with sort of analytical skills, strategy skills that lend into the company, help with some projects, and for some of them stay there. For others, they evolve into products or other marketing position, in my case, corporate development, marrying sort of both my consulting and my finance background.
Great. And for the past few years, you've been leading the corporate development and strategy team at LinkedIn. Tell us about what your role entails.
There are multiple ways of doing corporate development. So first, I'll describe a little bit how it works at LinkedIn and to why I enjoy it so much, actually. But the opposite approach to what we're doing is where corporate development is effectively in-house M&A bankers who come in when a deal has already sort of been approved internally and negotiate term sheet, run due diligence, and sort of then go on to the next thing. We have the opposite, which is very viable and totally fine approach. Our role is more of a mix of strategy and sort of market intelligence all the way down to M&A. So to give you a few examples, we publish weekly newsletters to the rest of the company on sort of all the important news in that week across all of the various marketplaces that LinkedIn works into. We also track 20, 25 public companies' earnings and have sort of a lot of trackers around all their forecasts, all the sort of minute data that they share to compare their performance to ours internally, et cetera. So that's just knowing the landscape. Then we work closely with the R&D teams, product and engineering on understanding their roadmaps. And then from there, trying to figure out, are there companies that could be interesting or spaces that are interesting to engage to learn more and potentially see if there are ways to accelerate through M&A or investments. We also do investments. Then from there, we can do the more traditional, if there's a deal, we help the product and engineering team put the case together, put the strategy together, the financial plans and goals together. And then from there, negotiate a deal, run due diligence, etc. And then finally, we also oversee the performance of the integration.
That's a very wide spectrum of
Yes.
responsibilities your team has. I guess starting at the very top of strategy, right? I think strategy is a term that could mean a lot of different things. What I'm really curious about is how do you guys go about facilitating the strategy setting process at LinkedIn? And how do you make sure that you have a thematic approach as what you're describing, but also having the agility to respond to different technology trends, especially given the industry changes so much?
Yeah. In a way, part of my team's job is to be relationship managers with various business units within LinkedIn and to be in the flow of information with those management teams, which we do through various forums. But the idea is we are close to the product and engineering leaders. So we know what's their roadmap, what are their sort of 3 years plan. And from there, we have conversations with them of like, out of those things, which ones are the ones that would make sense to explore more. Sometimes it's a relatively new strategies or areas for LinkedIn, and the exploration is more about learning to start with. And sometimes there's more specific, oh, we need to solve this question, or we need to have a team that can help do this tech. Like, is there a good fit in the market for that? It comes down to being close to the business leaders and being in the conversation so that we can propose ideas, flag companies potentially interesting to them, and engage with them.
Awesome. And you were kind of bringing this up, but how do you go about deciding what makes sense to build in-house by the product engineering leaders versus what makes sense to perhaps fast track or develop through an acquisition?
Generally, we evaluate both. So if something is a priority and we don't have we have a team that's doing it and it's now in maintenance mode or sort of evolution mode as opposed to something new, then that conversation always leads to some level of exploration. And then from the exploration, you get a sense of, okay, well, do we have candidates who have the right tech, who have the right teams or the right business that really help us accelerate? And in many ways, one of the criteria later on for financial evaluation is actually the difference between how much it would cost to build it versus buy it, including the acceleration that making an acquisition can provide.
That makes sense. And when you think about perhaps the acquisitions and investments that have been made over the last few years, what would be the breakdown of perhaps like new exploration thematic opportunities versus core capabilities that you're hoping to advance?
Generally, they're at the fringe of core capabilities, meaning if it's something we know really well, it's going to be hard to find teams that are that much better in startups at some of the things that are specific to how we run our network or things like that. But if you go a little bit beyond that, which is more lines of extensions of what we do, that's where it becomes interesting. And usually we have good conversations. So it's not too far out there that it doesn't make sense for LinkedIn, but it's also sort of at this space where we're still learning, we're still exploring, and we know we have to build over the next 2 to 3 years, but we don't necessarily have something that's 80% there already.
Awesome. And on this podcast, we've previously hosted quite a few different venture capital investors. And when they talk about deals, they're often talking about market size, the founding team, traction. I can imagine that looking at acquisitions from a strategic acquire point of view is quite different.
Yep.
Could you perhaps shine some light around like the deal evaluation process that you guys go through?
Yep. Maybe to put a little context, there are effectively 3 types of acquisition if you boil it down. One, there's what's called acqui-hires, where effectively what you're doing is hiring part of the team, even though it's through a format of acquisition. So that then comes down a lot to the founders and the engineering and product teams evaluation for the most part. And that's actually run almost like a recruiting process. It's heavily based on the results from the interviews. Then you've got a tech and talent, which is you end up evaluating both the team. And so that still is an important piece. And you oftentimes sort of require certain people to join for the acquisition to go through. But you also evaluate the tech and evaluate how good it is or how incremental it would be versus what we can build. And also potentially how fast you could integrate it into your stack, depending on the situation, so that you can figure out, okay, how fast does that accelerate my roadmap? And then the final, the more classic, the one that everybody talks about in general or makes it to the news is really sort of full business acquisitions, and that's a sort of more classic evaluation of the full P&L of that business, including what I mentioned, the strength of the team, the value of the tech, but also then the business itself. So those are the three flavors. But if you take a step back as a strategic acquirer, to your point, the first thing we actually start is with strategy. And is this a strategy fit? Sometimes we say this internally. If you could buy them, forget pricing, basically. If you could buy this company for $1, would you still do it? And would you do it on the basis of it's generally painful to do an acquisition and to do the integration, or it requires effort and it disrupts resources from being allocated somewhere else? Without thinking about pricing, is this worth it? Then we'll figure out the financials, etc. But the first filter always is this aligned with the strategy? Can we quote unquote sell that to a executive sponsor on the executive team that will sponsor the deal? And then from there, the first approval internally is actually what we call a strategy approval, where we don't talk about numbers. And that's generally with a broader team, the product team, etc. And then there is a follow-up meeting to that is focused on the financials and what we need to make this work financially. But that comes later, and it's a much tighter, smaller group, so that most people actually aren't aware of where the pricing lands for a while.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And I think one thing I'm also curious about is the cultural element of it. As a strategic acquirer, as you're mentioning, you have to think about post-merger integration. How do you guys go about assessing whether, let's say, this startup you're looking at would be a good cultural fit?
I think it happens organically through the process, right? You have multiple meetings with those teams. You figure out, can we work together effectively? I don't know if it's just about cultural fit, because actually cultural diversity is important. We've done an acquisition in Israel, for example. We didn't have an office in Israel, and we still made it work. And in some ways, it was like, great. Like, we're bringing also a new outlook on some of the things we're doing in general. And that team is now part of a broader team within LinkedIn that's mostly based in the US, but that's also in India and in Israel now. As part of that, though, we met them in person there, and a deal generally takes so much interaction that you get a feel for how that's going to work. You also have, when you get closer, specific conversation with some of the founders, for example, in that case, about the expectations for what their role are going to be once the acquisition is over, how long you put in place sort of the version of retainers to make sure they stay long enough to make it work, etc. That's generally there. We do have sort of more formal evaluations than when we interview teams as well, to get a view on, again, not necessarily just fit, but are we going to work positively together?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, as you mentioned, diversity of thought is incremental value to the company as well, beyond perhaps just the talent or the tech that you're acquiring. Mm-hmm. Switching gears a little bit, I think you talked a lot about the importance of strategy fit. I'm curious about, as you reflect on the last few years that you spent at LinkedIn, how do you think LinkedIn strategy has grown or shifted in the years? And then moving forward, what are some themes or extension opportunities that you and your team are most excited about?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn has continued to grow generally pretty fast. That growth generates a lot of needs in and of itself for our sort of new product lines, additions to what we are doing. If I think about our marketing business, you end up with questions around measurements and proving value to customers, et cetera, that sort of have been there, but some of those things become more and more acute as you grow. You find in many ways like LinkedIn is becoming more important piece of a number of people, and with that comes more product requirements. And so that's what we've helped quite a bit with through, again, investments, partnerships, and then acquisitions. Partnership is a different team, but we work very closely, obviously, to each other. Part of the value that CorpDev brings to LinkedIn is also the outside-in view. You meet a number of companies, and not all of that is acquisition. But frankly, we learn, we refine our own thoughts on markets, and we find partners through that process, and that's also valuable to the company as a whole. In terms of themes, I mean, not surprising, if you look going forward, Gen AI is all over the place, both because it's a new product, it's also a new UX way of interacting basically between product and users. And then finally, it comes with new infrastructure requirements. 2 years ago, nobody had heard about LLM ops, and that's now a thing. That's a way for us to engage, learn, and explore. Also compare and contrast what we're doing internally to what we're seeing startups or earlier stage companies do.
And do you have any favorite ways of keeping up with the tech trends? It sounds like you and your team have to spend a lot of time building that outside view in. How do you go about keeping on top of all of it?
We follow a lot of newsletters. I mentioned earlier, we publish internally that newsletter every week. We have people that are sort of specialists, if you will, by areas, and we track a lot of news sources, a lot of analyst reports to be on top of all of these trends. Yeah.
Any particular newsletter that you are really fond of or podcasts?
Maybe one that's a little bit different, just to something that's not obvious, like TechCrunch or something like that. I quite like Ben Evans. I follow him. It's not necessarily always right into what we're doing, but it's always sort of interesting twists on things. So that's one that I'd highlight for sure.
Awesome. Actually, I think I have his newsletter as well and agreed it's quite a interesting take.
Nice.
So I think as I was mentioning before
Oh, Casey Newton, sorry, is also the other one. It's pretty big, obvious.
Awesome. We'll take notes and I'm sure our listeners will love all of the suggestions.
Okay. Well, if you want a final one, Lenny's newsletter is very hot with PMs. And even from a strategy standpoint, it's interesting.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think Lenny's has a podcast as well.
Yeah.
Which is quite good. Cool. And I think that actually ladders perfectly into the next set of questions, which is just surrounding career advice. Many of our listeners, as I was mentioning to you earlier, are younger professionals or students. And I think a lot of us are curious about, as you reflect on your career, different choices that you've made. So to start off, I think one thing that is top of mind for many of us who are in school is picking kind of the right company to join out of school.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of debate within tech whether to go to a big tech as the first job versus perhaps going the startup route and being more adventurous. Do you have any thoughts on that, and how would you advise students to go about picking between big versus small tech companies?
You should come to LinkedIn, of course. I might have a bias because I also do venture, etc. But I might have a bias towards maybe exploring startups if that's something you want to try. My view, especially in enterprise, it's true, but in general, in the enterprise space, there's sort of two times where it's easier on a relative scale to be an entrepreneur. One, when you come out of college, you kind of have nothing to lose. And two, it's probably a little bit later after your kids are old enough or you've got enough money on the side or something like that. But there is a financial component that kicks in, which probably makes a lot of people like 30, 35 harder for them to jump into startups unless there's a sort of a specific setup that happens. Not a bad idea to explore, but I think it's a theme in general of how at least I've approached my career. And I don't know if it'd be my advice, but actually exploring areas that you're interested in to develop new skills. Early on, it's all about developing new skills. And the illustration I'll take from my own career is I started as an engineer. I never actually was an engineer. I ended up doing tech marketing and strategy. Then I did the CFA to go into banking. Then I went into consulting. And all of that was literally a big exploration somewhere in between finance and strategy. That leads me to corp dev naturally, even though it took me way too long to actually figure that out. But I think it's partially what differentiates my skills right now, which is I've done those things that people don't usually do together. And so you end up with, and the reason I love my job and hopefully I'm a good fit for it is that view that, hey, at LinkedIn, corp dev is really everything from strategy, investing in startups, and M&A, which I've done all of these things in different avenues in life. That exploration and the saying of like, you're coming out of Wharton, you're obviously in a great position, but it's only the beginning in many ways. Like you keep exploring, keep that view, and sometimes making lateral moves actually is the right answer, especially if you're learning something. The other, and I'll probably stop at two because that's way more wisdom than I have, but the other advice I sometimes give to people is go where you feel you're good at because it creates a positive feedback loop. If you're good at something, you're going to get praise, you're going to get promotions, etc. And that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy in many ways. And usually what people are good at tend to be functional more than industry. I'm good at the intersection of finance and strategy. I could do it in another industry. I just like tech is a great environment for me, but I could probably do M&A in a different space.
That's really good advice. Thank you for sharing both pieces. I think I wanted to double click on the skills piece a little bit more. I'd imagine as we grow in our careers, the skills that we should be acquiring become different over time. As you reflect on your own journey at LinkedIn, and you've obviously had a very successful career and continue to have a very successful career, are there particular skills that you think you underappreciated that are actually extremely important in what you do versus ones that maybe you see others over index in the recruiting process or you see young people over indexing are perhaps not as important?
Communications, the ability to synthesize what you're working on, what your strategy is, and be able to have the 30-second version of that all the way down to let me do you a full 3 hour presentation. But that skill is very, very helpful. Yeah, it will make you stand out in whatever else you're doing, basically. Frankly, take as many chances to present to executives as you can, but also basic things like how do you organize it? Like I was just recommending today, the pyramid principle. It's an old book. It's a little cliche, but actually just that basic blocking and tackling of how do you structure an argument? Do you go, how abstract can you go from the 30-second elevator pitch all the way down to the full strategy? That's what makes the difference, like even in pretty much any function, actually, I think. Because people are around you are going to be good in tech. A lot of great talent comes to tech companies. And so the people around you are good, which is great because it makes for a great learning environment. But I think that skill is probably what makes a little bit of the difference.
Yeah, and I think to your point, especially in tech, there is often experts from different fields with like very deep topical knowledge. And I think as business leaders, one of our roles is kind of bringing that together to push things forward. And perhaps that's where communication is also extremely important.
I was listening to, what was the podcast? I think actually it was the Lenny podcast. I was listening to that episode with Nancy Duarte, who runs a very successful comms. And she gives an example of like how she applies that in her marriage and like how she communicates with her husband to get him to do something, for example. And this thing applies everywhere. The other thing that I like is negotiation, but negotiation not from the angle of like you're always negotiating a deal, but there's all these little tidbits that are similar to communication for how to make people feel comfortable, how to make people feel heard. And all those things are part of what I would probably coin as communication, which is the ability to both communicate your ideas, but also make sure people feel heard and understood, because that's where they get to a basic level of comfort that they can actually then engage with you.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. And I was going to say that you also do angel investing on the side, and you were talking about this a little bit earlier. So many of our listeners are also aspiring entrepreneurs, or they are working kind of iterating on their own business during school or outside school. But I'm curious, from your angel investing experience, do you have any words of advice for founders who are just getting started at the earliest stages of journey? Whether that's mistakes you've seen other founders often make that you'd advise them to avoid, or things that you've seen founders do really well.
And at the early stages, right?
Yeah.
Maybe to set some context, I'll talk about the phases of life of a startup, which is basically two, so it's fairly easy. And then it translates into other things. But effectively, there are two, because ultimately you need fundraising. So there are two phases in the life of a company linked to how VCs basically evaluate companies. There's everything after a Series B, which comes down to at that point, you actually have a working, functioning system company. And pretty much all the evaluation, or the most part of the evaluation, is slicing and dicing all those numbers to figure out your traction, your likely market, blah, blah, blah. It's a financial spreadsheet to some degree exercise. And that's also very clearly the space where even external signals can pick up to help evaluate a company, like what's their growth in headcounts, how many engineers do they have, like all those things. At that point, the founders matter, but they matter a lot less, to be honest. Everything before this is how do you go to what people call product market fit? And that's a period of intense iteration, and that's driven by the founders and their vision. You're early in a company, you're raising money. This money is to effectively experiment your way into product market fit. So sure, you can talk about how big the market is, etc., but it's mostly BS. What really matters is who the founders are, how willing they are to go through that phase of experimentation. And then more generally, sure, how big is the market that they're operating under? Because if they strike gold, is that enough of a gold mine or not? It really, early stages, really, to me at least, comes down to 90% who are the founders. and what tells me that they are, to some degree, I don't know if it's unstoppable, but the premise is this: it's irrational to be a founder. And generally, the top founders have something that drives them. You can call it a trauma, a chip on the shoulder, or something like that. And what's your story for wanting to be a founder, which means your life is going to be hell for 10 years, even though that might be a very successful startup? Not rational to want to do that. Generally, people have a reason why. And so maybe you can get in touch with that. Like, what's your reason? Because then it manifests, sure, your product you're experimented with or your product you're passionate about. But the thrust is the founding team at the beginning. I mean, it's obvious.
Yeah, and I kind of going off of that, right? Like in this process to find product market fit, when do you suggest founders pivot to a new idea versus maybe giving it one more try and being a little bit more persistent with going down the path that they're going down?
The way I would go to define product market fit, and then you figure out if you're on the path, is you're a founder today and you're saying, usually you're starting to have a product. And what I actually recommend people do is, okay, write down the 3 to 5 metrics that sitting where you are would tell you, okay, I have product market fit. And going back to this idea of iteration, are you making progress towards on those metrics towards the goals where you would say, okay, well, that's product market. Because then you can, even when you engage with VCs and other folks in the ecosystem, you can have a sort of rational conversation about what are the levels at which you get product market fit. Like a random one is generally a 15% or more conversion rate for sales is a good number. All the caveats because it's by industry, et cetera. But it's generally, you can figure out, okay, what have successful companies achieved in terms of those metrics? Am I on the path to getting there? And it might be different things. Usually revenue, by the way, is a byproduct of this, not an input. And so it's more about how many customers do I have? How fast do I convert customers? If it's an engagement product, how often do they engage with it? I was just having a conversation this morning with somebody who's an ex Splunk, and Splunk basically says, if your engineering team uses our product 5 to 10 times a week, then they're going to be a customer. If you're creating a product in a similar category, like are your early customers using the product 5 to 10 times? So that's one of those metrics. And then you've got to be realistic. Like, are you making any progress towards moving those metrics?
Yeah, love that. And I think that's insightful and also tactical for founders who are listening to this episode to take action on.
One thing I would add, maybe as a last data point, if it's interesting there, an important metric, the way I see it, but also proven by data because correlated with success later on, is the speed at which you go from your seed round to your Series A, basically. And that's also another way of you're a founder. Are you on path from your seed to your Series A in 18 ideal, 24 months, depending on market conditions, to get to your Series A? So you're making progress towards your product market fit. Do you think you're going to get there by the 18 months or 24 months milestone? That's an important reality check. And of course, there's plenty of counter examples because it's venture and there's plenty of type 1, type 2 error. But there is something there around velocity and momentum. And so unless you do a hard pivot and you're basically resetting the company, which, by the way, you should probably do a new company, but anyways, but unless you've done a hard pivot and you can basically really claim, okay, well, completely different, that element of momentum is actually an important thing for you to watch.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think fundraising traction is another signal of whether the company's basically on the right trajectory or not.
Maybe final advice for founders, the quality of your VCs, even early on, matters because it's a signal. Who's your lead often matters. And I know YC, especially coming out of YC, sort of pushes for close your round quickly, which means a lot of top VCs don't have time to do their diligence. And I think that's a mistake.
Interesting.
Because it helps with recruiting, it helps with reassuring customers. There's plenty of downstream effects. I don't know if it's really particularly because they're going to help you and their advice is going to be life-changing for the company. It might be for some of them, but just the reality of the signal is important.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so many good nuggets in this episode. I'm really excited for aspiring entrepreneurs to listen to this and hopefully influence their perspectives. And hopefully, I'm sure they'll learn something new out of this episode. That wraps up the main content of our episode. What I'd love to do at the very end is a quick round of rapid fire questions to just get to know you as a person. So your challenge is to answer these questions in 2 sentences or less, whatever comes to your mind. You ready for it?
It'll be hard.
Awesome. First question. What is your favorite memory from your MBA?
The parties.
Awesome. The parties are still as good. We're in next question. Best movie you've ever watched?
Wow. I'll answer with the best series, which is The Bureau, which is a French series, but actually is amazing.
Awesome. I've never watched it, but maybe I will after this.
Oh, it definitely is worth watching.
And final question for you. If you were not in technology, what job would you have pursued?
Either telecom, but you can consider it as technology because that's where I come from, or I'd be in banking.
Awesome. Staying true to the intersection of finance and strategy.
100%.
Well, that wraps up our interview today, Ben. Thank you so much for sharing your insights across your own career, across corporate development and strategy at LinkedIn, and wrapping up with some really nice nuggets for founders. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yep. No, my pleasure. I'm on LinkedIn, so if people want to ping me for follow-ups, I'll try to do my best.
Awesome. Thank you.